Okay, this video is about a book review. The book is called Brain Energy by Chris Palmer. Chris Palmer is a psychiatry attending at Harvard. I think he's been there like over 25 years. And there's some good things about this book. There's also some stupid things about this book. First of all, you need this abbreviation. MHD is mental health disorders, includes all this stuff. All of them are becoming more common. So I got pros over here, cons over here. So what did I like about the book? I think this guy, Dr. Palmer, he's actually trying to help people. So that's good, because most books are just BS. The author's a liar or an idiot or an ignoramus. That's not the case here. He's an intelligent guy and he's trying to help people. So, first of all, he tells the truth. Psychiatry medications don't work well. I think he said something like, there's not a single psychiatry med that gives you more than 50% 5-year resolution. And if you read about psychiatry meds, you'll be amazed at how bad they are. You'll be amazed at how bad the long-term consequences are of those meds in most cases. That's a topic for another day. He also mentions that $20 billion were spent by the National Institute of Mental Health, and in his opinion, and that of a colleague, there was about zero significant benefit to mental health patients. That's how stupid drug research is, okay? You can spend $20 billion on it and not get anything useful. Nothing, okay? It's like a lot of cancer research. Billions of dollars and you get nothing, okay? It's a big scam. Just trying to make money for drug companies. Okay, he also figured out that patients with metabolic disorders have more mental health disorders. So this is where what he did that was brilliant. And so he basically says anybody who has a metabolic disorder, diabetes, hypertension, or other ones, or an eating disorder, or a substance abuse disorder, they all have more mental health disorders. And he says it's all because they cause mitochondrial dysfunction, and he calls this the brain energy theory of mental health disorders. So metabolic disorders are mental health disorders. Mental health disorders are metabolic disorders due to mitochondrial dysfunction. And since mitochondria produce energy, he calls this the brain energy theory of mental health disorders. You can also call it the mitochondrial theory of mental health disorders. So far, so good. He's on to something good here. And the truth of it all is that if you have poor metabolic health, you're more vulnerable to a mental health disorder. Everybody's got sadness in life, setbacks, failures, disappointments, romantic breakups, loneliness, the death of a loved one, occasional insomnia, other stressors. We all have that. But if you've got good metabolic health, it helps you to handle it, to accept that as part of life and to be more resilient. Good metabolic health means good blood flow, better immune system function, higher energy levels. So fat, hypertensive, diabetic, alcoholic, substance abusers, they don't handle things so well. And so he does have a point there. That's all good, and by improving your metabolic health, you can make yourself more resilient against the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, the sadness of life. What did he say here too? He says that the most common cause of death in mental health disorders is diabetes, myocardial infarction, and stroke. Same old metabolic stuff. It's not suicide. If you got one mental health disorder, you're more likely to have other ones, 2 or more. Lots of people have a bunch of them. Now, he also tells the truth about religion. He says non-religious people, so like atheists, for example, they have 90% higher rates of depression. And they also have at least 5 times higher rate of suicide. That's been my experience too. It's sad, but I see these atheists, man, they're just pathetic. They do so much bad, stupid stuff. And the religious people are healthier. They have less cardiovascular disease. They live longer. In the blue zones, where they have the longest lived populations from the work of National Geographic, Dan Buettner, they're all religious. It's on page 277 if you want to look it up in the book. He says that mitochondria are the most important organelle. They're the first organelle that occurred in cells. They can do all kinds of unique things. They move around. They got their own DNA, etc. He says that mental health disorders, like major depressive disorder, they've been around since Hippocrates, which makes a good point that back in those days, other than the people who were starving, the food was relatively good. It was relatively naturally occurring, so to speak. But it makes the point that, and in my opinion, there's more to it than metabolism. Obviously, metabolism is important, but, sad things happen and they sometimes tip a person over the edge, even if they are eating healthy. So that's not the whole story. But the point is, if you have good metabolic health, good diet, good sleep, you exercise, you practice your religion, whatever it is, you maintain at least one good friend, have a purpose in your life. All those things make you more resilient and give you the best possible health. Oh, one thing funny too, he tells the truth about marijuana. Marijuana slows down mitochondrial function. It decreases a person's memory ability, and it causes brain atrophy. It's a disaster. MJ is a disaster, okay? Anybody tells you otherwise is an ignoramus, okay? They're selling it now just to take advantage of all the stupid chumps that would go with that stuff. Okay, now what did I think was bad about the book? First of all, this guy, Dr. Palmer, again, I think he's a nice guy, but when it comes to knowledge of nutrition and biochemistry and pathophysiology, he's an ignoramus, okay? He doesn't know basic nutrition, and it's pretty obvious anybody who recommends a ketogenic diet doesn't know that much about nutrition. He got the idea because ketogenic diet has been used successfully for treatment of refractory seizures, okay? So it slows the brain down, and he made the observation, well, a lot of psychiatric medications slow the brain down. So maybe slowing the brain down by diet would be a good thing. So there's a rationale to that logic. That's so far so good. But he never really goes into mitochondrial biochemistry. He never goes into the biochemistry of insulin resistance, of blood-brain barrier physiology, and I kind of joke about nutrition at Harvard's all clown school, okay? The head of nutrition over Harvard's this guy, Walter Willett. I've showed you his food pyramid before in my Harvard Medical's Clown School lecture. It's not even bad. It's not even mediocre. It's just completely wrong, okay? And this guy is almost down the same path. Maybe there'll be a few small patients who you want to slow down their brain with this miserable ketogenic diet that's not sustainable, but he really doesn't know what he's talking about when you get into real physiology, biochemistry, and nutrition. And for example, if you go into the index of the book, it doesn't include anything on aluminum, aspartame, MSG, MFG, F-, GP, Fe, HG. These are all basic neurotoxins, hexane. He doesn't go into high-fat meal, tissue oxygenation, SERCA inhibitors. The reason I tell you all this stuff is, I read a lot about the brain all the time. I've been interested in it for a long time. And, you can't really have an intelligent conversation about the brain unless you know about most of this stuff, okay? Anybody who doesn't is really a lightweight on the subject of understanding, cognitive impairment and brain function, okay? These are the basic subjects. You can't get around them. Oh, the other thing that's funny, there's a Harvard textbook of neurology, and it doesn't include almost all this stuff. It's a joke, but most medical textbooks are a joke. They're almost just like, designed for selling drugs, okay? They have very little useful information in them about the common diseases. Okay, what else? So he doesn't go into the standard theories of dementia, of cognitive impairment. He doesn't know anything about diabetes, Anyway, so enough about that. And I also think he's trapped into what I would call the keto conundrum, meaning that if you promote the ketogenic diet, big food likes that because it's hard for them to sell the lousy food they make, their meat and their oil and their processed food. So when a doctor comes along and promotes it, man, he'll get tons of free publicity. He'll have millions of views. This guy's got millions of views on the internet, and he's talking about mitochondria, and he doesn't know anything about, the biochemistry of mitochondria. If he actually learned about nutrition, what would happen, though, is then he would move towards a low-fat, whole food, organic, only 100% vegan diet. But what would happen? All these internet sites would ostracize him. So he's kind of screwed. He has to go with the thing that doesn't work well for the brain, the ketogenic diet, or he'll lose all his publicity, and he'll probably lose his grant money, too. And, working as a Harvard attending, what they want is to get grant money, most of them, if they're doing research, and grant money primarily mostly comes from drug companies. And the drug company wants you to sell drugs. If you're not going to sell drugs, then they're not going to give you grant money. So, selling, processed food and meat is like selling a toxin. And so unless you're willing to do that, you're not going to get any grant money. And he would probably end up getting fired over there if they're telling him if he switched to eating a low-fat vegan diet. Okay, so anyways, he also, spouts off a lot of generic, stupid advice like, you need to go for regular dental checkups. Yeah, right. That's what chumps do. If you take good care of your teeth, then you don't need to go to the dentist all the time. All right. He says inflammation is bad for mental health disorders, but then he recommends a keto diet, which is very, very inflammogenic, and it causes inflammation. So that's stupid. There's a lot of stuff like that. He doesn't mention things like, conventional medicine no longer is able to give you the definition of the difference between a man and a woman. And that's going to limit the ability to talk about relationships. If you're too scared to say that there are some differences between men and women, how are you going to talk about men and women? Men and women, since the beginning of time on Earth have had relationships, and every guy's had conversations with his buddies about women. Every woman's had conversation with her girlfriends about men. It's something that people do, but if you don't feel safe having a conversation about that, how are you going to give good advice? The other thing too is, oh, the obligatory modern medical book has to say meditation is helpful. Okay, and I actually made a video about why I don't meditate and sort of like, what is that all about? If you look at the history, like in India, there was a guy by the name of Ashok the Conqueror, and he sort of conquered everybody, and he was sort of this ruthless, brutal guy. And then once he conquered everybody, he said, I've converted to Buddhism, and I want you all to meditate. To meditate is to look inward. And he basically just wants everybody to be passive and wimpy and to shut up and not give him any trouble. And so that's what I believe also is part of why is meditation recommended so much. Now, don't get me wrong. There's some people who find it helpful. You focus on saying a word, om, 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 and it occupies your mind so you can forget about your problems for a while, lower your stress level, concentrate on your breathing. Okay, that's nice. But I can tell you, I've never heard of a heroic person who did great things who said they did it for meditating. Okay? I can tell you tons of the greatest people that ever lived in the history of the world will tell you they devoted themselves to God. Bach, every composition I make is to the glory of God. Michelangelo, I do everything out of faith and hope in Christ, okay? Isaac Newton, he spent a lot more time writing about the Bible than he did doing science, and he's the greatest scientist who ever lived. Fyodor Dostoevsky, the greatest novelist who ever lived, okay? And, you know, the greatest three novels, Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, and Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, they all have these Christian themes of redemption, okay? And I've seen tons of people who've turned their life around, come off alcohol, or all these big achievements, and that was a big part of it, okay? So that's partly why a lot of my heroes have done that, so that's why they inspire me. Versus conventional medicine, psychiatry, psychology, they can't even give you a role model. They'll tell you, oh, this patient did so well, they came off all their medications, or they're no longer an alcoholic or a drug addict, and that's wonderful, that's good. But they really can't give you much higher than that, because they're so worried about intolerance that they can't say one thing is better than another, one person is better than another. And, you know, you have to be able to do that if you want to achieve at a high level. I can say Bach is better composer than other people. Michelangelo is a better artist than other people. Newton is a better scientist. Dostoevsky is a better writer. You have to be able to have a clear-cut role model in order to achieve at a high level. You have to make decisions and distinctions, and that's just normal. That's some of the most opinionated people in the world are the really highly successful ones, and that's a big part of how they became successful. They know what is good or bad for them in their own particular field. So anyways, the book makes one great point about the metabolic issue and these disorders, but it's kind of stupid in another way. So I'm going to show you some other stuff that you might find interesting. So here's Isaac Newton. Spent a lot more time writing about the Bible than he did about science, and he's the greatest scientist who ever lived. I get a whole entire lecture on him separate. Here's this guy, Koenig, Harold Koenig, MD. I think he was at Yale. He wrote a bunch of papers and some books about religion, spirituality, and health. And he goes through the mechanisms, how it lowers stress level, helps a person find their purpose. And all the major religions, they're a lot healthier and better off than their, you know, demographically matched populations that are not religious. Here's an example of a typical book about the modern failure of psychology, how it can't tell you what a good person is. It can't give you good role models. And so you need something to aspire to. You need a role model. You need to know, I want to be like him. When I was growing up, I wanted to be like my dad. He was a hardworking guy. He was a doctor. He was always honest. He was good. He was an athlete. He read all the time, every day. He listened to classical music. He was nice to my mom and the family. He was a good role model for me. And you need a role model growing up to figure out, you know, what direction should you point your energy. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about art. So here's just a beautiful painting of Odysseus when he strapped himself to the mast so he could hear the sirens but not be moved by them. All the men are covering up their ears. And there's a tremendous amount that can be learned from the history of art. And this is great art. Here is Cicero, greatest of all Romans, and he says, to not know what happened before you were born is to forever remain a child. Okay, so the reason I show you that as Cicero is you have to study history, otherwise you're an idiot, okay? Lots of modern people, they're ahistorical. That's why they can't make value judgments, because they're so ignorant. They don't have any historical knowledge in their brain to compare things to, or to see patterns, or to see problems. Okay, Aristotle. Okay, we'll talk about Aristotle later. Here's just an example of a beautiful painting. I'm going to show you this to compare it with some other paintings. So this is Reflections on the Thames River by John Atkinson Grimshaw, and this is from the 1800s. One of the things, you know, I studied a lot about art, and I can tell you, the 1800s, you know, there was, of course, the Renaissance in the 1400s and the 1500s, but there was also this magnificent Renaissance in painting. in the 1800s. Some of it came out of the big money available in Victorian England, but it was more than that. It wasn't just England. It was also France. It was Russia. It was other countries as well. It's extraordinary the amount of great art that came out of the 1800s. And Ayn Rand has written about that. And look at this painting here. You know, on the surface of it, it's called a music recital by Luis Alvarez Catala. And lots of great stuff came out of Spain and other countries that were Spanish speaking. And what I'm trying to say is, there is sort of a glorification of mankind. Everybody is dressed up on their best behavior, trying to make the best possible music, the best possible singing, and the musicianship. This is noble. This is ennobling, okay? Classic music ennobles people. And what I'm trying to say is this is a view of mankind that was normal in the 1800s. After the really spot where mankind started really going downhill was World War I and the Russian Revolution. That sort of tipped mankind over the edge, and he sort of has been going downhill ever since then. It'll be pretty obvious when I show you some of these additional slides, but just get a sense of this. You feel sort of, you know, when you see this painting, kind of happy. You feel like this is nice. We'll listen to some nice music, have a nice conversation, and it's very human. And I show you this is the founding fathers of the United States of America. 95% of them were intensely religious and devout, and the other 5% were religious, okay? People say, oh, you know, Thomas Jefferson wasn't that religious. Yeah, right. By modern standards, Thomas Jefferson was a Christian fanatic, okay? He went to church every Sunday. He read the Bible every single night, gave a Bible to everybody he knew, insisted on it being taught in his schools. He, you know, made his own versions of the Bible, which, you know, he wanted to evangelize the American Indians. And what I'm trying to say is, when you read about these guys, there was no nonprofit corporation stuff in those days. They had opinions about everything. You know, a large number of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were all these religious pastors, okay? And they would pray. They would have church in all the, you know, the Capitol buildings, okay? All right, now I just want you to see this painting here. This is called Among the Sierra Nevada Mountains by Albert Bierstadt, you know, 1868. Whenever you see a magnificent painting, it's a safe assumption it was done probably in the 1800s, okay? Other than the old Renaissance stuff. So just look how beautiful this is, all right? So I show you this just to get a sense. I love this painter. I mean, he's one of the all-time, I think, top 3 landscape artists. But just, it's magnificent. It's the creation of God. It's beautiful. It's ennobling. You see this, and you get this warm, happy feeling. This type of art, it invites contemplation. We sense this is a work of greatness. This is a creation of God. This is something awesome. I wish I could draw like this. This is so beautiful. Why is it so great? I want to look at it. I want to study it. Okay, now I'm going to say a word or two about Ayn Rand, and she ties into this. Ayn Rand wrote this incredible book called The Romantic Manifesto, and it was really about what makes great art. Why is some art great and other art only okay, average, and why is some art bad? Okay, and so here's what Ayn Rand said about her career. The motive and purpose of my writing is the projection of an ideal man, to give people a role model of what's possible, of goodness, okay? The portrayal of a moral ideal as my ultimate literary goal is an end in itself, to which any didactic, intellectual, or philosophical values contained in a novel are only the means, okay? To improve anything, one must know what constitutes an improvement, and to know that, one must know what is good, and how to achieve what is good. And to know that, one must have a whole entire system of value judgments. As far as literary schools are concerned, I would call myself a romantic realist. So meaning that she came out of like romanticism, let's say from the early 1800s, which really brought man's feelings and emotions into a bigger role in creative art, creative literature, and painting. And here's a quote I love of hers about Aristotle. She loves Aristotle as the greatest philosopher, thinker, genius who ever lived. And I love Aristotle too. If you really study a lot of philosophy and history, you're going to love Aristotle, okay? And here's what she says about him. Aristotle said that fiction is of greater philosophic importance than is history, because history represents things only as they are, but fiction represents them as they might be, as they ought to be. And she continues, the primary value of art is that it gives man the experience of living in a world where things are as they ought to be. This experience is of crucial importance to him, like him being like a young artist. It is his psychological lifeline, and that is true. when a young person grows up and sees good things, has good role models, they say to themselves, someday I would like to create a work of art like that, a painting or a book, or simply a good life, a good coach, a good teacher, you know, a good nurse. So I want to be good like that. I want to be somebody who lived a life that made a difference, okay? That inspires a young person to good things. Ayn Rand continues, the motive and purpose of my writing can best be summed up by saying that if a dedication page were to precede the total of my work, it would read, to the glory of man. Okay, Ayn Rand. So now I do think that's a little funny, and people are going to tell you, well, Ayn Rand was an atheist. You don't really know her. Okay, I've read a whole bunch of her books. Ayn Rand will tell you her favorite author, the greatest author who ever lived, was Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. She said, I love Victor Hugo. She says to read a Victor Hugo novel is one gets the feeling as if they are walking into a cathedral. So that's why I call Ayn Rand my closet Catholic, okay? Because she loves all these Catholic writers. She loves Dostoevsky. She loved Quo Vadis, okay? You know, Henry Sienkiewicz, okay? Edmond Rostand and the other stuff. So now, what did Bach say? To the glory of God with his creations. And if man is created, if man is created in God's image, then he too can be a creator, okay? Now, there's other great persons of these Renaissance movies. And what did Ayn Rand say? She says, look back to the 1800s. She goes, and the early 1900s. I saw their books. I saw their art. They're magnificent. I want mankind to know, and I want to shout it out loud. You don't understand how great the art and literature was that came out of the 1800s. And once you see that, it's so awesome. You just look at the 1900s as a pathetic mistake. Okay, so here's another beautiful painting by one of these other great landscape artists, Frederick Edwin Church. It's just beautiful. It's called Above the Clouds at Sunrise. You know, you see this, how could you not feel a sense of God's creation and how magnificent it is? And if you're a painter, how could you not be in awe of that and wish you could do something like that? And of course, you know, the stories from the Bible, they're very inspiring, and they give you strong examples of right and wrong. So this is called Behold the Man by Antonio Cesari from 1871. And you'll see these paintings didn't just come from one country. They came from many different countries. The Christian tradition inspires great art. It's that biblical worldview that man is created in the image of God that inspires him to also be a creator. And you just sense the magnificence of this, the tragedy of it. You know, as Jordan Peterson has said, the greatest tragedy of all time, the best person was treated the worst, okay? He was completely innocent, okay? So look at this now here, Michelangelo's Pietà. This is the most beautiful statue ever made. You look at that and you're like, how could a human have done that? That's so magnificent. That's so good. It's so beautiful. I mean, it was sad. His mother died when he was only 7 years old, and he missed her. And it's almost like, in a sense, you sense this is Michelangelo with his mother, and she's like big compared to him, like when he was a boy. But it's just such a beautiful sculpture. Okay, so now what am I getting at? What do I mean by modern man is degraded? And when I say modern man is degraded, this is partly why the incidence of psychiatric diseases is going through the roof. It's also because the water is poisoned with F-. The air is poisoned quite often with, you know, aluminum and other factory pollutions and exhaust pollutions. The food is poisoned with all these, you know, GMO, herbicide, pesticide sprayed crappy foods, with not to mention all the stuff in them. There's aluminum in the water too. So all of those things are also causing cognitive impairment, metabolic dysfunction. The overload of estrogenic preservatives are making people sick. And you know, the good news is once you learn about these things, they're almost all avoidable. Okay, so here, for example, is a Picasso. And everybody says, oh, Picasso was a great artist. Picasso stinks, okay? It's just peer pressure conformity to try to say you like Picasso. What is beautiful about that? You have to be able to look at something and objectively have an opinion. If you think that's beautiful, I think there's something wrong with you. I think it's, you know, it's kind of bizarre, kind of weird looking. It's certainly not very human looking. And then look at how crappy the buildings are. These are modern office buildings. They look like animal cages. So here's a quote by Tom Wolfe, the great American writer. He says, every modern office building looks like animal cages, and they always have a statue of a turd in front. And that's totally true. Go look at some of these modern buildings. This is degrading. It's an insult to call that art compared to the paintings we just saw. And, you know, a good question is something is really, you know, quality art. Could a child have made it? If it's something a child could have made, then it really isn't sophisticated art. Come on, this is BS. And I'm also going to tell you, a lot of modern science is equivalent to this in art. And not being able to tell the difference has caused a lot of people to suffer. Okay, so and there's always like this peer pressure. Well, the experts say so. Well, the experts, you know, in my experience, more often than not, are full of BS. Okay, so here's a quote from George Orwell from the book 1984. The heresy of heresies was common sense. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and your ears. It was their final, most essential command. And yet, and this is Winston now, the head character of the book, he said, and yet he was right. They were wrong and he was right. The obvious, the silly, the true, it has got to be defended. Truisms are true. Hold on to that. Stones are hard. Water is wet. Objects unsupported fall toward the earth. With that feeling, he was setting forth an important axiom. He wrote, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4. 2 + 2 makes 4. If that is granted, all else follows. So medical common sense of 2 + 2 = 4 is the best way to cure a dietary disease is to improve the diet, okay? All right, a few other thoughts here. Well, here's a quote by Carl Jung, okay? And Carl Jung, I think, was a step of progress in psychology, okay? I think he can be improved upon, but Carl Jung did say and do some good things. So Carl Jung says, the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? Religion is a basic human need. The majority of my patients consisted not of believers, but of those who had lost their faith. The ones who came to me were the lost sheep. Among all of my patients over 35, they all had a problem finding a religious outlook on life. Every one of them had fallen ill because he had lost what the living religions of every age have given their followers. And none of them had really been healed unless they regained their religious outlook. And I can tell you, the happiest, most impressive achievers I ever met in my life were quite religious. It empowers a person in a lot of ways, the great religions do. John Ruskin, here he is painted. This guy did a lot to help with the Victorian Renaissance in England in the 1800s. And some good stuff came out of that. He made the great speech. I have a separate lecture about him. He made the great speech that really sort of helped the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood of painters, the very realistic painters, to become better known and to popularize their painting. And they were magnificent painters. You know, John Everett Millais painted this picture. Now, if you read about Ruskin more, you'll see that in many ways he was a millionaire who devoted his life to helping people and promoting good culture. He was a great man, but he was also kind of sad and pathetic and lots of genius. There's always something crazy, sad, or pathetic about all the geniuses, so that's just part. Now, here's a typical example of a pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood painting. This is by Edmund Leighton, a little bit in the later version of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. They're just magnificent, okay? Godspeed, okay? You know, he's going off to fight, and, you know, she misses him, so she ties a garter around his arm, okay? And you feel the love. You get everything. You look at this painting, and it's immediately... It's beautiful. It tells a story. It's beautiful, but it's sad at the same time. You catch the architecture. You catch everything. The chivalry. It's just great art, and there's a ton of it. Here's another one. This is the most famous painting ever in the history of Ireland, Meeting on the Turret Stairs. You know, the same story. The lover has to go off to fight because that's a man's duty, and they miss each other. They're sad. They don't know if they'll ever see each other again. And this is the most famous painting. He's an Irish painter. Most famous painting ever in the history of Ireland. It's just beautiful. You can intensely feel the emotion. You want to contemplate it. You're kind of in awe of the artist's skill. And so what I'm saying is, after seeing that nonsense of Picasso, look at those paintings we just saw, and look at this. Here's another painting. This one's called Sierra Nevada. So similar name, but it's a different painting, obviously, by Albert Bierstadt. By the way, I think he's the best landscape artist who ever lived. And don't get me wrong, I love the other ones, Thomas Cole and Frederick Edwin Church and some of the other ones, but it's just beautiful. I mean, you look at this and you get this feeling of warmth, of awe, of goodness. It's magnificent. So anyways, that is why I think modern psychology can't help people as much as it wishes it could, because it doesn't address what is the purpose of life, what is the meaning of life, what is my role in this world, how can I get the most out of my time on this planet. And Christianity and the other great religions, they answer those metaphysical questions. And if you want to get the most out of your life, you're going to have to come to terms with those metaphysical questions. And so that's why once you remove all this metaphysical stuff from psychology or psychiatry, you end up a lot of times with BS. What does psychiatry do? It just puts a person on a bunch of drugs that don't work and cause brain damage. Okay, so I think you need to have the stuff if you really want to get the best results. and you want to have that, man is created in the image of God and respect for the individual, you have to have all this stuff. And this makes you want the best for the person rather than going with the, well, I'm obligated to drug them with all these drugs or electroshock and all this other stuff. So you have to be able to say, here's examples. Gee, you want to be a great philosopher? Then read about Aristotle. You want to be a great writer? Then read about Dostoevsky, etc. You want to be a great artist? Look at Michelangelo and some of these other ones, and Raphael. You want to be a great, whatever it is, you have to be able to come up with role models and help the person, figure out a path to self-improvement. And getting that sense of purpose makes a person more resilient, and it makes them happier, and it makes them better able to stand up to the problems of life. So anyways, I hope this was helpful.